The face on Tessa Arden's screen was almost exactly the face her father had described for 36 years. Not the black armor at Darek Solan's shoulders. Not the pale geometry of the command deck behind him. Not even the fact that an invasion fleet had returned to Neris after 36 years of silence. The face. Tessa knew the small details from her father's stories. The scar at the left temple. The narrow crease beside one eye. The habit of holding his chin slightly forward when he was waiting for someone else to reveal more than they intended. 36 years had passed on Neris. Darek Solan looked as if he had aged a season. His eyes moved across Tessa's face, stopped, and sharpened. Arden. Tessa did not answer immediately. Behind her, the operations room was already dividing itself into emergency cells. Displays shifted from civilian traffic to defense corridors. Local coordinators acknowledged pre-assigned authorities. No one waited for Tessa to tell them how to breathe. Yes, she said. Solan leaned closer to his camera. The boy from the first campaign. Where is he? Tessa felt every person in the room hear the question. He's my father, she said. He's old now. For the first time, Solan's expression changed. Not much. Just enough. A man at Tessa's side whispered. He knew 36 years had passed. He knew the number, Tessa said softly. Knowing what it means is different. On Solan's bridge, an officer spoke to him outside the shared channel. Solan glanced away, listened, then returned his attention to Tessa. 36 planetary years, he said. Yes. For us, considerably less. I know. There was no wonder in his voice. The physics was not a surprise to him. His fleet spent most of its long transit close enough to light speed that years on Neris became months aboard his ships. There was no travel into the past. No door through time. Both sides moved forward. They simply did not move through time at the same rate. Solan looked past Tessa, as though he could see the world behind her. What did you do with 36 years? Tessa almost smiled. You came back to find out. The channel closed. Less than a minute later, the first strike. Warnings appeared. Solan did not fire blindly at targets from an old map. His probes had watched Neris during approach. He knew the orbital yards had multiplied. He knew several command facilities had moved. He knew the fleet architecture had changed, the cargo lanes had changed, even the way reserve power was distributed had changed. But when his attack plan unfolded across Tessa's screens, the sequence was familiar. A major coordination center, a shipbuilding cluster, a freight corridor, different places. The same question. If I break this, what else stops? Tessa watched the first center disappear from the network. A voice on the defense net said, Central link is gone. Another voice answered immediately. Regional authority confirmed. Switching to independent protocol. Tessa closed her eyes for half a second. 36 years earlier, people had said something else. They had said, wait for the order. And while Darek Solan waited to see Neris collapse again, Tessa remembered the story that had shaped her whole life. The story of what happened when her father was 16. 36 years earlier, Neris had thought efficiency was a kind of strength. In many ways, it was. The central coordination hubs could process information from hundreds of defense sites faster than local commands could. The largest shipyards were not only factories, but ecosystems of specialized production. A hull could arrive as raw frame material and leave with engines, navigation, heat shielding, life support, and weapons integrated under one authority. The freight system was even more efficient. A small number of major corridors moved most strategic supplies because concentration reduced cost, delay, and waste. Nothing about that design had been foolish. It had simply been designed for a world that had never met Darek Solan. Eli Arden was 16 when the warning sirens began. He was carrying 2 crates of maintenance couplers through a transit depot. The older technicians were busy preparing local shelters, and someone had told him that if he wanted to help, he could at least move things. The first explosions happened far enough away that he did not hear them. He saw their consequences instead. Every display in the depot changed at once. Freight schedules vanished. Military traffic lanes locked. Civilian routing froze. Then half the screens went gray. Central is down, someone said. Another voice answered. Secondary will take it. People waited. Eli stood beside the couplers. A minute passed. Then two. A defense officer entered the depot and demanded access to a heavy transport. The depot supervisor said he could provide one. The officer gave him a destination. The supervisor hesitated. That route is military restricted. I am military. You don't hold release authority for depot stock. The authority node is gone. Then secondary has to release it. Secondary isn't answering. The two men stared at each other. Nobody was stupid. Nobody was cowardly. Nobody wanted to waste time. But the system had been built around decisions arriving from places that no longer existed. The transport sat 10 meters away. It had fuel. It had a driver. It could move. And for 9 critical minutes, no one had the authority to move it. By the time an emergency release finally arrived, the route the defense officer wanted was under attack. That evening, Eli found himself in a shelter beside a woman who had flown patrol craft for 9 years. Her squadron still had ships. Most were intact, but their central tasking network had gone silent. Then secondary command had inherited too much traffic. Then a local commander had waited for clarification because 2 possible missions carried conflicting priorities. When the clarification arrived, the enemy had already passed the point where the squadron could intercept safely. We had ships, the pilot said. Eli did not know why those words stayed with him. We had ships, she said again. We had pilots. We had fuel. We had time at first. What didn't you have? She gave him a tired look. Permission soon enough. Darek Solan never tried to destroy all of Neris. That was the genius of the first campaign. He looked for places where destroying one thing caused 10 other things to lose value. A major fabrication yard was hit. Smaller factories survived, but they did not all build complete vessels. One produced drive components. Another produced pressure frames. Another made guidance assemblies. The main yard had been where those parts became ships. A freight corridor was cut. Warehouses remained full on both sides of it. One side needed what the other side had. The supplies existed. The ability to connect them did not. A command center disappeared. Units under it still had weapons, crews, fuel, and local sensors. But situations changed faster than inherited authority. Some commanders acted. Some waited. Some made reasonable decisions that directly conflicted with other reasonable decisions. Solan's fleet did not erase Neris's strength. It separated strength from the ability to use it. One loss created another. That second loss created 3 more. The damage traveled through dependencies faster than Solan's weapons traveled through space. Ele surviveth. He never knew whether survival was skill, luck, or simply the fact that the enemy had considered his district unimportant after the central network failed. The first invasion ended without a full surrender. But entire regions were shattered, production fell, orbital defense was forced back, and Neris accepted limited concessions that bought time at a cost no one wanted to call defeat. Solan withdrew before his fleet was exhausted. Eli learned why years later, from recovered tracking and logistics estimates. The invaders could not remain indefinitely. Their ships were built for campaigns, not occupation. Maneuvering fuel, reaction mass, replacement parts, thermal load, and reserve margins all narrowed the longer they stayed in the system. Most important, their retreat itself had a schedule. Far beyond Neris lay an automated resupply station positioned along the fleet's relativistic route. To reach it with safe reserves, Solan had to depart within a limited window. He did not need to destroy Neris. He needed Neris to collapse before his own clock forced him to leave. The first time it almost had. After the fleet disappeared, Neris began telling stories about the war. Eli noticed which stories people preferred. Pilots who stayed at their posts. Crews that rescued trapped civilians. Engineers who kept damaged. Reactors alive. People needed those stories. Eli understood that. But he also noticed what people avoided. Confused orders. Delayed authority. Factories that had parts but could not assemble them. Units that survived but became useless because a command node vanished. Mistakes were embarrassing. Failure was politically dangerous. Some reports shortened awkward details until the events sounded inevitable. Eli began asking a question. He asked it first to the patrol pilot he had met in the shelter. then depot workers, then freight controllers, then technicians, local officers, medical coordinators, station managers. What did you still have that you couldn't use? The answers filled files. We had 6 transports, but the routing key was gone. We had 200 tons of drive ceramic, but assembly was on the other side of the closed corridor. We had an intact squadron, but no authority to change sectors. We had backup command, but no one expected backup command to inherit 3 regions at once. We had information, but nobody knew which version was current. Eli did not write a manual called How to Beat Solan Next Time. He was not qualified to write one. Instead, he made a record of what had actually failed. He included bad decisions, late decisions, reasonable decisions made under assumptions that turn out to be wrong. He included systems that had performed better than expected and systems everyone had trusted that failed immediately. Years passed. Eli became a technician, then a logistics analyst, then a man with less hair and more patience. Tessa was born early in the recovery years. By the time she was old enough to ask why her father kept recordings of people admitting mistakes, the first invasion was history to her. To Eli, it was memory. To Darek Solan, somewhere along a relativistic route, it still felt recent. Neris rebuilt. It built newer ships, better sensors, stronger orbital platforms. But people who had studied the failure records argued that weapons alone would not solve the real problem. A larger central shipyard would still be central. A stronger command node would still be a node. A faster freight corridor could still be cut. So the structure changed. Large yards were broken into networks of modular production. No single facility could replace all others, but more facilities could replace parts of each other's functions. Emergency authority was pushed downward, not unlimited authority. That would only trade paralysis for chaos. Local commands received specific conditions under which they could act without waiting. Civilian and military systems adopted more common interfaces. A freight tug could move military cargo if normal logistics failed, and a civilian fabrication line could manufacture standardized emergency components if a military yard disappeared. Units trained for command loss, not as a rare technical exercise, as a basic condition of war. Tessa grew up inside those changes. She heard her father tell people, "Do not copy what we did. Understand why it failed." When she entered planetary coordination, Eli warned her about the most comforting mistake in history. People like believing the dead already solved things for them. Did you? No. Good. I wrote down how we made a mess. That's less inspiring. It's more useful. 36 years after the first invasion, Solan returned. And now, in the operations room, Tessa watched the second campaign test whether 3 decades of change meant anything. The coordination center Solan had struck vanished. A generation earlier, local commands would have waited for reassignment. Now the regional groups switched authority modes. Not perfectly. One group acknowledged too slowly. Another interpreted a priority differently from its neighbor and sent escorts toward the same convoy, leaving a nearby medical route thinner than planned. But nobody stopped simply because the top disappeared. Then came the strike on the production cluster. Tessa watched its status fall from active to damaged to offline. A younger officer beside her whispered, "That's 19% of orbital frame completion." "Not anymore," Tessa said. The officer looked at her. Tessa pointed to the redistribution map. Several smaller sites had already accepted parts of the lost workload. None could absorb everything. Production slowed. Some ships would not be completed. Some repairs would take longer. But the chain did not stop. A freight corridor disappeared next. Chieftif. The alternate route was inefficient and crowded. 2 convoys were delayed. One turned back. One made it through. The system bent. It did not snap. Solan saw the same thing from the other side. He had destroyed real targets. Important targets. He had not been tricked into wasting ammunition on empty structures. Yet the consequences were smaller than before. He changed tactics. He increased pressure on one sector until several Neris units were forced toward the same support network. Tessa saw the trap. One orbital repair platform lay at the center of the threatened area. It was valuable. It had survived the first war and been expanded twice. A generation of planners had considered it important enough to defend heavily. Solan pushed toward it. Local commanders began asking for reinforcement. Tessa studied the movement. If she reinforced fully, Solan could compress more defense assets into a single volume. If she did not, the platform would fall. Her father had once told her about people who treated old importance as permanent importance. Tessa opened the platform's transfer record. Over the previous decade, several functions had been distributed elsewhere. Not all. Enough. Evacuate non-essential crews, she said. The officer beside her stared at her. We can still hold it. Yes. Then why abandon it? Because holding it is becoming more expensive than losing it. The officer took a breath. That platform has been there since before I was born. So has my father. I don't intend to defend him against a battle fleet either. The officer almost laughed, then realized she was serious. Tessa authorized withdrawal. Solan took the platform. He gained a real victory. Neris lost real capability. But he did not get the concentration of forces he expected. The campaign continued. Neris lost ships. A reserve route overloaded and failed. One local commander used emergency authority too aggressively and had to withdraw after committing to a threat that proved smaller than expected. The new system was not magic. It made different mistakes. That mattered. At the end of the campaign, Solan's fleet remained the stronger force in open battle. But once again his logistics officer placed the withdrawal threshold on his display. Reserve margins were falling. The resupply route would not wait. Solan studied the defense network. He had broken more than enough targets to cripple the old Neris. The new Neris was bleeding. It was not collapsing. He ordered withdrawal. Before leaving, he changed the question he intended to answer next time. The first campaign had taught him where Neris kept its strength. The second taught him that strength had been distributed. So the next question was obvious. What made the distributed pieces act together? Another 36 years passed on Neris. For Solan, another small portion of a life. For Tessa, enough time to raise Noah. Noah grew up with an enemy who belonged simultaneously to history and the future. His grandfather had met Darek Solan at 16. His mother had faced the same man at 35. Noah knew that if the pattern continued, Solan might one day look at him with the same recognition. He found the idea disturbing when he was young. Later, he found it useful. Solan had something no archive could give. Continuous personal memory. He did not study the first campaign the way Noah studied it. He remembered being there. He remembered exactly how a Near's command center behaved when overloaded. He remembered the delay before local units acted. He remembered the patterns of concentration that appeared when the defense came under pressure. That memory had made him dangerous. But Noah began to wonder whether memory also created speed of another kind. The speed of assumption. He reviewed reports from the second campaign and found moments where Solan reacted unusually fast to familiar structures. A particular communication surge, a certain pattern of ship movement, a production increase near a threatened sector. Each time, Solan interpreted the signal in light of something he had directly witnessed before. Usually he was right. That was the problem. People corrected beliefs that failed. Beliefs that remained mostly correct were harder to examine. Noah presented the idea to a defense planning group. One older strategist frowned. You want to feed him false data? No. Build fake command centers? No. Then what exactly are you suggesting? Noah displayed an old coordination site. This place still operates. Yes. It still handles real traffic. Yes. It used to be impossible to lose. The strategist looked at the diagram. Not anymore. Exactly. They began calling them tactical fossils. The name was almost a joke. Old structures with familiar shapes, still real and still functional, but no longer carrying the same essential role. A command center could remain active without being indispensable. An old shipyard could continue producing without remaining the only place capable of a critical process. A familiar fleet formation could still be used when appropriate without indicating that the entire defense depended on it. Neris did not need to create a fake world. It only needed to let Solan see a real world through assumptions that had aged more slowly than the world itself. In year 72, Darek Solan returned for the third time. This time, he did not attack old coordinates. He created pressure. Then watch what Neris did. Where did data increase? Where did ships converge? Which factories increased output? Which sites temporarily received more authority? He was patient. Noah watched the invasion from a regional strategy cell and understood that Solan had become more dangerous. The enemy had learned. That was important. If Neris survived only because Solan refused to adapt, then Neris had learned nothing. A central coordination site increased traffic under pressure. Solan did not strike immediately. He increased pressure elsewhere. The site increased traffic again. A shipyard shifted to emergency output. A familiar formation appeared near a threatened corridor. Solan cross-checked the signals. Then he attacked. The coordination site was hit. It was real. People died. Systems vanished. The shipyard was damaged badly enough to reduce production for years. Noah stood before the status display and felt the difference between theory and cost. A tactical fossil was not a decoy. If it did not matter at all, Solan would recognize it as meaningless. Its value came from the fact that it still mattered, just not enough to kill the whole system when lost. A woman in the strategy cell said, "We let him take it." Noah looked at her. "No, we failed to stop him from taking it." Same result. No, the words matter. Neris was not controlling every outcome. It was preparing to survive outcomes it could not control. Solan's third campaign caused serious damage, but also taught him exactly what Neris hoped he would learn. Under enough pressure, certain nodes still became busier. Certain formations still appeared. Certain industrial sites still surged. Solan concluded that Neris had distributed ordinary operations but could not escape convergence under crisis. No civilization could, he believed. Coordination required concentration somewhere. Perhaps the concentration moved. Perhaps it changed names. Perhaps it lasted only minutes. But it existed. Find that moment. Break it. The rest would follow. His conclusion was intelligent. It was supported by real data. It was also becoming obsolete. Solan withdrew at the end of the third campaign with greater confidence than he had after the second. On Neris, the confidence worried Noah more than open defeat would have. Because Solan was now looking in the right direction. Neris had distributed production. It had distributed emergency authority. It had reduced dependency on individual sites. But crisis still caused temporary concentration. If Solan became good enough at identifying those moments, he could simply move up one level and recreate the first campaign against a newer architecture. So the final 36 years were spent on the hardest question, not how to create more centers, how to remain coordinated when no center could safely be assumed to survive. The first attempts were bad. During a major exercise, two regional clusters interpreted the same threat condition as requiring immediate action. Both moved to defend the same corridor. A third corridor was left thin. Another exercise produced the opposite failure. Local commanders had authority, but the rules describing when to use it were so restrictive that everyone remained technically empowered and practically hesitant. Noah, older now, watched the recordings with a familiar discomfort. Neris had solved paralysis once and recreated it in a more sophisticated form. The answer took years to simplify, not automate. Simplify. First, shared priorities. Every cluster had to know what mattered most if no new instruction arrived. Second, defined authority. Not vague language about acting as needed. Clear boundaries. Third, observable conditions. A cluster should not require a secret message from central command to know what was happening. It could observe when a hostile formation had stretched beyond mutual support, when a neighboring cluster had gone silent, or when a corridor could no longer be defended economically. Fourth, lateral coordination. Neighbors had to be able to divide responsibility directly without sending every decision upward and waiting for it to come back down. No artificial intelligence was given control of the war. Algorithms could compare tracks, estimate fuel, predict ranges, and flag conditions. They could not carry responsibility for choosing the whole strategy. The strategy had to exist in advance as shared intent and bounded authority. It remained expensive. That created another problem. By year 100, most people on Neris had never seen Darek Solan. They had heard about him. They had watched historical recordings. But they had also spent their lives paying for duplicate yards, reserve networks, training cycles, decentralized storage, redundant communication, and local command capacity. Some argued that Neris was organizing itself around an enemy who might never return. Some are right about specific waste. Several old systems were removed. Others were redesigned. Noah supported some cuts that surprised younger officers who assumed the Arden family existed to preserve everything associated with the old wars. Why remove this? One asked him during a review. Because it was built for the second campaign. It worked. It worked then. It could work again. So could a door hinge. That doesn't make it a defense doctrine. The officer gave him a skeptical look. Noah tapped the old plans. Solan's mistake is assuming that because something worked before, its meaning stays the same. We don't get to make the same mistake just because we're on the other side. By year 108, Noah was old. His grandfather Eli had been dead for years. Tessa belonged to a generation that had already handed direct command to younger people. Noah no longer controlled the defense. That was deliberate. He advised. He argued. He recorded. But the people who would face the fourth invasion had built careers in a Neris shaped by lessons they had not personally suffered. That, Noah thought, was both terrifying and necessary. Then the warning arrived. Solan was back. For the fourth time, Darek Solan entered the Neris system. He looked older than he had in the first campaign, but not by much. On Neris, children born after his third invasion now held command authority. Entire industries had appeared, matured, and been replaced since he first saw Eli Arden. Cities had expanded beyond old maps. Some had changed names. Others had not. Solan's officers gave him updated reconnaissance. The data was excellent. That mattered. He was not trapped by ignorance. He saw the new ships, the new routes, the newer distributed production. He knew Neris had spent another 36 years changing. He built his final campaign around that fact. This time, Solan did not ask where the central command was. He created stress in several regions, then watched where the system concentrated function. A major coordination complex increased traffic. Solan applied pressure elsewhere. The same complex received more strategic load. Several old formations appeared. Communication density shifted. Production orders passed through channels that matched patterns from earlier campaigns. Solan waited. His executive officer asked, "You think that's the convergence node?" "I think they want us to think we cannot find one." "That's not the same thing." "No." Solan watched the data for another hour. Then another. Every test strengthened the conclusion. At last he gave the order. The strike hit. The coordination complex disappeared. It was not fake. Hundreds of local processes lost their preferred connection. Some data archives vanished. People died. A large portion of Neris's high-level coordination capacity was gone in seconds. Solan began counting. He knew the old delays. He knew how long uncertainty took to become disorder. On Neris, one cluster lost its senior command link. One local coordinator, one of thousands of people Solan would never know existed, opened the emergency authority table. Her sector's priorities had been defined months earlier. Protect evacuation lanes. Prevent hostile control of the orbital repair chain. Support adjacent cluster defense. When doing so, did not abandon the first two priorities. She did not ask a dead center what to do. She sent a lateral request to two neighboring clusters. One answered. The other did not. Under the old system, silence might have created uncertainty. Under the new one, the silence itself was information. The missing cluster was assumed degraded until proven otherwise. Its assigned coverage was divided according to standing rules. Elsewhere, a logistics network lost access to the central allocation engine. Local systems shifted to emergency quotas. They were inefficient. A convoy arrived at the wrong depot. One repair group received half the components it expected. Another received too many. Nothing was graceful, but it continued. Solan waited for the cascade. It did not come. He selected another node. Hit it. Neris slowed. Did not stop. He severed a major communication corridor. Several clusters lost clean synchronization. They moved to degraded timing. One local commander misunderstood a neighboring unit's withdrawal and committed too early. The mistake cost ships. Solan saw the loss. For a moment, he thought he had found the fracture. Then the neighboring clusters absorbed the open responsibilities. The failure remained local. That was new. Solan leaned toward the display. Find a real center. His officers tried. They found important sites. Very important sites. They found places where losing capability hurt. What they did not find was a place where losing capability forced everyone else to stop. To suppress one cluster, Solan had to attack that cluster. To prevent its neighbor from supporting it, he had to assign ships to the neighbor. To hold a corridor, he had to keep ships in the corridor. To disrupt production, he had to hit multiple production sites instead of one. Every decision was rational. Every decision consumed fleet geometry. The invasion force began to spread. On Neris, the change was not announced by a dramatic command. No one announced a final plan. A defense cluster observed that one hostile group had moved beyond the distance where its nearest support could respond quickly. That condition matched an authorized opportunity threshold. The cluster changed posture. Two neighbors saw the same geometry. One agreed to support. The other had a higher priority threat and declined. No crisis followed. The first two acted. A hostile formation was forced to turn and spend maneuver reserve. Elsewhere, another cluster detected that a Solan group had already performed enough high-energy course changes that its future options were narrowing. Three local groups adjusted. One moved visibly to draw attention. One threatened the easiest retreat path. The third waited. The Solan group did not die. It escaped, but escape cost more reserve. Those costs accumulated. Neris paid too. A cluster misread a hostile feint and moved early. Solan punished it. Ships were lost. A station had to be abandoned. At another point, lateral coordination failed because two local networks held different timing estimates after a sensor relay was destroyed. The mistake opened a corridor for 11 minutes. Solan exploited it. Neris did not become perfect. It became harder to kill through someone else's mistake. The distinction decided the war. Solan's fleet spread wider. His ships still won many direct engagements. But each one had to be purchased locally. There were fewer cascading rewards. The fleet that had once won by cutting nerves was now forced to fight muscles one by one. Solan's logistics officer approached his command position. We're approaching withdrawal margin. How long? At current expenditure, not long enough to continue this geometry safely. We still have superiority. In combat power, yes. Then we keep pressing. The officer hesitated. Solan noticed. What? If we keep pressing at this separation, we can continue winning engagements. But every separated group requires more maneuver reserve to rejoin. If they force us to keep responding locally. I understand. The officer said nothing. Solan looked at the map. Neris was not winning cleanly. Several defense clusters had been shattered. Orbital infrastructure was damaged. A shipyard burned. Two major transport lanes were closed. If the old Neris had suffered this much, its surviving strength would already be trapped behind command failure and logistical paralysis. This Neris continued, making imperfect decisions. That was the problem. Solan ordered one more concentrated attack. Neris yielded the threatened region rather than gather enough force to defend it. Solan took territory, but he did not get the concentration he wanted. The retreat angered him more than resistance would have. They were refusing to value targets the way he expected them to. Then, three defense clusters shifted toward one of his extended wings. Not simultaneously. Not under one detectable command burst. One moved first. A second responded to the altered geometry. A third waited until the first hostile group burned reserve changing course. The three Neris clusters did not try to destroy the wing. They made remaining expensive. Solan's ships withdrew several thousand kilometers and reformed. Elsewhere, the same kind of pressure began to appear. 1,000 local choices. Not random. Not centralized. Bounded. Aligned. Solan watched the reserve line descend. For the first time in 4 campaigns, he understood that the central problem was no longer finding the correct target. The problem was time. His fleet could keep fighting. It could destroy more stations. It could kill more ships. It could perhaps win every major engagement still ahead. But the route to the resupply station did not care who had won more engagements. The margin was physical: fuel, reaction mass, thermal reserve, distance, velocity. The fleet had to leave with enough of all of them to survive the next leg. Neris did not have to defeat him before the deadline. It only had to remain organized enough not to surrender. The logistics officer returned. "We have reached the final safe. Withdrawal margin." Solan stared at the map. "What if we extend? We risk losing the route. Probability? Too high." Solan knew what the officer was doing. Not hiding behind a number. Refusing to pretend that tactical success changed physics. He looked once more at Neris. A century earlier, he had broken a few essential places and watched the rest of the world lose the ability to use what remained. Now he had destroyed more total capability than during that first campaign. And still the surviving pieces kept making decisions. Solan gave the order. Withdraw. The war did not end with a final devastating shot. It ended with Solan's withdrawal order. Neris had remained capable of resistance longer than he could sustain the invasion. As the fleet accelerated away, Solan requested the archive from the first campaign. A map appeared beside the current one. He expected to find the deception. He expected some grand falsification. Instead, he found continuity. Several names remained. Some facilities occupied nearly the same locations. A few command routes had descendants that followed old paths. The coordination complex he had destroyed in the final campaign had been real. It had mattered. The old shipyards had been real. The tactical formations had been real. Neris had not shown him a fake civilization. Solan enlarged the two maps. Then he understood. In the first campaign, a particular command center had been a brain. In the last campaign, a similar center had been an organ. Important, useful, painful to lose, not fatal. In the first campaign, one industrial complex had been a bottleneck. In the last campaign, a comparable complex was only one part of Neris's total capacity. Losing it reduced output. It did not end output. In the first campaign, a familiar concentration of ships had meant the defense was being forced to gather. In the last, the same formation could appear locally while other clusters remained independent. The shapes were familiar. The meanings had changed. Solan's memories had not failed him. They were accurate. That was what made them dangerous. Campaign after campaign, he had improved his method for attacking what Neris had been. Between each lesson, Neris had been given 36 years to become something else. On Neris, people celebrated carefully. Too much had been lost for easy triumph. Noah Arden watched from a room much smaller than the command centers of his youth. He was old enough now that walking long corridors annoyed him, and he had no desire to pretend otherwise. No one called the victory Arden's victory. He would have objected if they had. The defense reports listed thousands of contributors. Engineers who had redesigned production standards. Local coordinators who had argued for clearer authority rules. Crews who had discovered failures during exercises. People who had died in the second and third invasions. People who had never heard Eli Arden's voice. People who had made mistakes in the final battle and then corrected them before the mistake spread. That evening, Noah went to the archive. Eli's oldest records had been transferred across so many stored generations that the current system contained layers of verification simply to prove the files had not been altered. Noah opened one. His grandfather appeared as an old man. Not the 16-year-old boy Solan remembered. Eli looked tired in the recording. He had been near the end of his life. If they come back, Eli said, they'll come back with a memory of us. Noah listened. They'll remember what frightened us. What broke us? What we defended too long? What we couldn't afford to lose? Ili Gosit. But what they remember will be us from yesterday. He did not say what Neris should do. He did not name a strategy. He did not predict the final battle. That was why Noah still valued the recording. Eli had left a question, not a command. Noah opened a new archive entry. He began with the things that had gone wrong. Cluster 7 had reacted too early. The Westerlateral network had carried conflicting timing data after relay loss. Two emergency supply pools had duplicated the same allocation while another region went short. One withdrawal had begun 11 minutes later than it should have. A command rule that had worked in exercises created unnecessary risk under real sensor interference. Noah recorded the successes too, but he refused to let victory polish away the failures. A young archivist watched him work. "People are going to study this war for a long time," she said. "That's what worries me." She looked confused. "We won. So did Solan, the first time." The archivist was silent. Noah pointed toward Eli's file. "My grandfather spent his life making sure we remembered why we failed. We spent ours learning how to stop failing the same way. And now we make sure nobody mistakes our way for the last way." He completed the record. The archive requested a classification. Noah considered several options and chose the simplest. Operational history. Not doctrine. Not permanent standard. History. He placed the new record beside Eli's. More than a century separated the two men when they had made those recordings. They had lived in different versions of Neris. One had watched a world freeze because too many people were waiting for permission. The other had watched a world survive because people had learned when they no longer needed to wait. Neither had the right to decide what the next Neris would become. That was the point. The war was over. The archive stayed open. And somewhere in its growing memory, Neris preserved something more useful than a perfect way to win. It preserved the right of the next generation to learn from yesterday without being forced to remain there.